Hi everyone, this is Courtney Spitzer, the project coordinator for our Early Psychosis Learning Collaborative. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. Now I just want to review a few housekeeping items before we begin. Participant microphones have been muted at entry, and you'll be able to unmute them during the discussion portion. During the presentation, if you have any technical difficulties or questions about the topic, please use the chat box. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing at a later time on the MHTTC website. To reach us after the webinar, you can email newengland@mhttcnetwork.org. Next slide, please. This slide provides a description of our disclaimers for MHTTC. Next slide, please. The MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. That language is strengths-based and hopeful, inclusive and accepting of our diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, healing-centered, trauma-responsive, inviting to individuals participating in their own journeys, person-first and free of labels, non-judgmental and avoiding assumptions, respectful, clear, and understandable, consistent with our actions, policies, and products. With that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Michelle Friedman-Yakubian for introductions.
Thanks so much, Courtney, and thanks all of you for spending your Thursday afternoon, or depending on what area of your country that you're in, it might still be morning, with us. Very excited to continue our series, which we've called Coordinated Specialty Care Basics. This is an initiative that is sponsored by the Healthy Knowledge subgroup of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Early Psychosis Working Group, as well as the New England Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Region 1 as well. And this project, our goal is really for this series to provide a nice introduction for people that might be new to working in coordinated specialty care for early psychosis, to learn some of the basics that might be help for getting the big picture of the important work that they're going to be involved in, as well as to get excited about being a part of this work. So this series is part of a 7-part webinar series that focuses on 7 different areas and topics related to coordinated specialty care for early psychosis. And we're going to be using the recordings from these webinars to help us to build a course that's going to be provided for free on the Healthy Knowledge platform, that will provide modules that folks could go through at their own pace in order to learn some of the basics of coordinated specialty care. Here's a list of some of our upcoming sessions, as well as some of our previous sessions, which are already included on our website if folks that have missed the first 2 and are interested in seeing those as well. And our basic schedule is every Thursday at 2 p.m. So now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, and I'm going to need to briefly take our share off so I can access my notes for this. So we have 2 wonderful speakers today. Raylyn Elliott-Remus is an instructor at Michigan State University School of Social Work. She began her work with particular emphasis on early psychosis experiences in 2010 as an individual resiliency trainer, clinician as part of the RAISE Navigate study. She continued her work as an individual therapy provider, part of a coordinated specialty care team, providing both IRT and CBT for psychosis, therapy and training. And Jacob Helmick is a musician from Western Michigan. He received his Bachelor of Music from MSU in 2012. Jacob has lived experience with psychosis for the past 6 years and has worked as a peer support specialist from 2019 to 2021. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Raylyn and Jacob to this webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you all for having
Thank
us.
you.
We're very excited, and I'll speak for myself and saying very nervous to be here, but thank you all for your time. Okay, so Jacob and I have organized our presentation today to kind of walk us through the different phases of individual therapy, both the beginning, working, and closing or transition phases of the therapeutic process from our different perspectives. Next slide, please. So here's just kind of an at-a-glance brief outline, and we've kind of labeled it based on our different perspectives. I, as the clinician, am really aiming to anchor their work through a firm foundation of the therapeutic relationship. I want to identify and inspire some purposeful use of strengths and develop a meaningful goal that's going to serve as the anchor for the work.
And from my perspective as the recipient of individual therapy at that beginning phase, a lot of people aren't there because of something that occurred easily or gradually in their life. They're there because of a crisis, and it might not feel like something they chose for themselves. So there's this deciding if we can trust the therapist, what are we here for, all those things are being worked out at the beginning.
So given that context, I, as the clinician, in trying to build that relationship and support some trust building, it's kind of simple. It's about being really authentic, conveying your genuine interest in their story, your investment in their well-being, and a recognition of the personal strengths they're bringing to this process. The strengths piece is so important, and it's represented kind of here on this slide, that I typically take within those first few sessions the opportunity to engage the client in a brief strengths test. And this is drawn from the individual resiliency training manual out of the Navigate coordinated specialty care model. And it is a 25 question brief strengths test where you identify your top 5 strengths. And throughout that process, then we start developing a conversation about creative ways to use those strengths to support the wellness process. And this is a way, again, to start building the natural resilience. You're not building, but recognizing the natural qualities that are going to support this process. And this is rooted in positive psychology and the work of Martin Seligman, among others, and was first introduced to me back in 2010 as part of that RAISE Navigate study. And these strengths will also then go on to serve as the resources to support goal achievement or the process. Next slide, please. So as I also mentioned, we're really hoping to establish some meaningful goal because it will serve as the anchor for the work moving forward. And this is taken again from the original IRT manual, that individual resiliency training manual. And I particularly love this slide because it allows an opportunity for the client to self-reflect on different life domains and rate their level of satisfaction across those domains. I love this because if you notice on the far right-hand column, you'll see an I would like to change column. And this to me is wonderful because it really acknowledges that just because we are dissatisfied with something doesn't necessarily mean we're ready to change it. Conversely, just because we're really satisfied with something doesn't necessarily mean we're not still wanting to enhance this. So it really gives you some insight into readiness as well as what is most important for the person you're working with. And Jacob, I didn't know if you wanted to speak to this process of evaluating these different life domains.
Yeah, just having a simple worksheet like this can be so helpful because it takes the question from a sort of vague and imposing, how satisfied are you with your life overall, and you have to come up with all the specifics on your own. Most people would feel like, well, I kind of feel satisfied, but I also feel very unsatisfied, and I can't say how, but this lists out like, oh, friendships, oh, family relationships, finance, spirituality, creativity, and gives an opportunity to peek at which areas might warrant attention first.
Next slide, please. Thank you.
So there are some challenges when it comes to goal setting, not the least of which is if someone has been brought to a coordinated specialty care team by a crisis, that it feels like it's something foisted upon you and oh, my therapist said I'm supposed to have a goal, so that's why I have a goal. And that's a really extrinsic sort of imposed feeling thing. And we have to find the ways in which goals are intrinsically rewarding or for the reasons that the client finds meaningful. Some other challenges with goals is it does set up this potential to see things as a pass-fail mentality and then get discouraged if you don't get all successes. So oftentimes the granularity level or how large versus small, usually smaller goals you're setting becomes very important.
Excellent. Next slide, please. So kind of building off what Jacob was saying or speaking to what Jacob was saying, there's some tips as far as, those SMART goals. If we keep it small enough and can build successes from that. But if you've done, as those of you who have even done the work, no matter how narrow and specific we get it, sometimes we're just not quite getting it. So some of the challenges Jacob mentioned have been common enough for me that sometimes I have shifted and adapted my language and approach to mirror more ACT principles, acceptance and commitment therapy principles. So using this approach, it lends itself to a little bit more flexibility. So to give you an example, if we were to establish a SMART goal of, I want to run a 5K in a month.
Can you remind me what the acronym SMART is?
Thank you. Thank you. Specific, I might need some help here. Specific, measurable, attainable, or realistic and timely. Did I get it right? Anyway, maybe someone in the crowd can help me with that.
Timely, time measurable, yeah.
Yes. It's all about the specifics of it, right? And making it measurable. So thank you, Michelle. So if I set that goal of running a 5K and then a smaller step to run 3 miles in a week, like Jacob mentioned, if I don't run that 3 miles, then I failed. I didn't do it, which can lead to the sense of discouragement. Whereas if I link my goal of running 5K to a value of healthy living, then yes, I can live out that value by running a mile that day, but I can also take my dog for a walk or eat an apple in between a meal or go to bed a little bit early. So it gives a little bit more options to live out some of these values that avoids the pitfalls of this pass-fail.
Just because we're looking for measurable things sometimes doesn't mean we have to live on a grid, intensely measured. Things can connect in more subtle ways too.
Exactly. Next slide, please. So to introduce this concept of values and valued action and value congruent living, I've used a real compass as the analogy to show that how values can give our life direction or purpose. But, Jacob and I were talking about this. More often than not, people have an intuitive understanding of values, even if they haven't necessarily done some of that self-reflective work for themselves. But to support that work, I have used some of the tools that are bulleted there. The values card sort, which can be easily found from a Google search done by Miller, Baca, Matthews, and Wilborn. You can also find a variety of values clarification worksheets online. I've also relied on what is called the life summary exercise, which is taken from, again, that individual resiliency training manual. And the life summary is simply this. It has you imagine yourself as an older person at the end of your life. And when you reflect back on your life, what are the things you hope you would have achieved? And that simple question usually reveals what is most valued and most important for the client you're working with. And as you begin to build that value set, then again, you integrate a conversation of what strengths will you find yourself relying on or drawing from to take those valued actions and live this value congruent life. Anything more you wanted to add to that, Jacob? I couldn't remember.
I'd just say that it's usually possible to find some way to connect, to bridge between someone's strengths and their values, because there tends to be some alignment between those two things for someone.
Absolutely. Next slide, please. So once we have this foundational phase, hopefully well built, and I should kind of underscore and highlight that hopefully the relationship is finding some footing. But if you assess that there's any relationship ruptures, then making sure that you're doing proper repair, because all of the therapeutic work will be resting on that foundation. Not to say there won't be bumps along the way, but really making sure that you have a decent foundation before we start kind of shifting into this working phase. And in this working phase, it's simply this: preserving this curious stance, dropping any and all assumptions about the client's life or their thought processes or the information they use to rely on certain conclusions they have about themselves or the world around them. Just really preserving a curious stance. And throughout this curious questioning and this curious place, you'll begin to gather the information to support a formulation. And we're going to go on to give you a few ideas on different ways to formulate, because my goal today is really to communicate. There's not a single way to work with early psychosis experiences. There's a variety of different options out there that have that are supported in evidence. But we are going to use that formulation to then inform our intervention, and we'll talk a little bit about some ideas for that. Meanwhile, you're always assessing stage of readiness. I know the slide identifies substance use in particular, but we're talking about any change goal. We need to be assessing readiness to inform the pacing of the therapy and the intervention approach. And Jacob, from your perspective?
Yeah, we're going to get into a number of sort of formulations from CBT, et cetera. And I know when I was first presented with those things in therapy, there was a sense of I wasn't maybe deserving to use this tool, or maybe it wouldn't be tailored to fit my thinking style because I'm a unique individual and this is something that's sort of one size fits all or something like that, or I didn't come up with it, so I don't deserve to use it or something. But as hopefully a client will come to see these as things they have ownership over, and just because other people have used them before doesn't mean they could be any less effective for you personally. And I think kind of the way we know that we've gotten to the working phase in a therapy relationship, for me, when I knew I was in the working phase was when I thought of my therapist as a tool that I could use, almost kind of jokingly, I say it in almost like a callous kind of way, like as plainly and simply as if I'm trying to pick at a screw with my fingernails, I'll think, oh, I'll go get a screwdriver, duh. I find myself getting stuck in a rut of thought or whatever challenge comes up that week. Oh, duh, I can get someone else's perspective when I go in for my session this week. So a therapist is happy when they've gotten their client to think of them as a tool they can freely use.
Great. Excellent. Next slide, please. So this is just the basic cognitive triangle, which most of you are familiar with. I think they call it the thought-feeling model in the IRT. This can also be referred to as a maintenance formulation. And Jacob, I'm going to let you take over here.
Yeah, so this thought, behavior, feeling relationship is one way we can try to clarify what someone is going through and what approach can be taken to it. And the example drawn here is something from my own experience. I'll start with the thought of it. is the thought, my own mind is the only thing I've ever directly experienced. So it's the only thing I can be certain is real. I've heard stories about other people seeing things and feeling things from their perspective, but I've only ever experienced my experience of them experiencing those things. So how do I know there's other eyes out there? And I think I'm trapped in my own experience. And that influenced both the way I felt and the way I behaved. So feeling I felt alone because I felt disconnected from other minds and hearts that were out there, maybe trapped, maybe scared, and behavior-wise, that led to giving up on conventional communication with other people. Either I thought there was no one there listening, so why speak? Or this is another common thing in psychosis is maybe you'll think the other person already knows everything I'm going to say, or they've read my mind or something, so I'm not going to bother speaking it aloud. So in this example, it's an instance of thoughts influencing behavior and feeling. And in that example, using this tool, thought, behavior, feeling separation, it sort of became clear that, oh, the thought is the really stuck part for me in this instance. So where we go is maybe the behavior is somewhere easier to change. Switch behavior from sitting to walking, or from ruminating to talking with someone. And that in turn can affect the feeling and the thinking. We've got some other formulations too.
Excellent. Yes, next slide, please. This is just a little bit of an expanded template from what you just saw. This includes a core beliefs, which actually, let me go back to that there in a moment. It is important that we are linking our thoughts, feeling, and behaviors to specific recent events in an individual's life, because we're wanting to see how are these things showing up now. And again, we're trying to figure out, presumably we're spending time on the things that are still causing distress to support intervention. But we can also use this same cognitive triangle to illustrate how, relaxation can be maintained, or joy can be maintained, etc. But for informing intervention, we want to link it to recent events, and then we may begin to what may end up getting revealed are some of the core beliefs the person may be walking around with, which is represented there in the bottom. Some of our core beliefs usually are formulated over time, over the course of our life experiences, but can end up serving kind of the lens by which we view the world and others. So it clearly has relevance. But in the interest of time, actually we'll go to the next slide. And this gives you an example more for your personal reference of how this might look. And next slide, please. And Jacob already kind of alluded to, well, what do you do with this information once you had it? We're calling it a maintenance formulation because, again, there would have to be consensus that this cycle is maintaining current levels of distress. If it's not, then there's no cause for intervention. But if it is, there are a couple options, and the client gets to lead that choice, right? If we wanted to disrupt this cycle, where might we start? And if the client chose, I want to change how I'm thinking about it, a common strategy is a cognitive restructuring approach, which is where you evaluate the evidence for and against the thought, and then you would look at that evidence, and based on that, come up with a new thought that's reflective of that evidence. And it's important to say that we're not getting into a debate about what's real, what's not, what's right, what's wrong, whether or not your thought is distorted and errored. Poor CBTp gets such a bad rap, or CBT gets a bad rap for that. This is not what it's about at all. It's all about, is it helpful? If this perspective, this way of thinking about something is helping and contributes to your well-being, then great, and there's nothing to do with it. But if there's agreement that it's not helping, and it's actually bringing you high levels of distress, then might we look at alternative ways of looking at the same situation? So it's very pragmatic in that way. How is that working for you And if it's not, how do we come up with different ways? There's also mindfulness practice, which supports cognitive diffusion. We will talk a little bit here in a moment about, very, very briefly, about some compassion-focused approaches. But I'm going to let Jacob talk up a little bit about the role of Socratic questioning, as how he's described to me ways that he's has used that strategy in his own life. But
Socratic questioning, and I think it kind of ties to the evidence gathering thing that CBT will do sometimes too, is the idea of having, when we're there with a therapist, we have a literal another perspective, two points of vision, getting stereo vision on a problem, but one eventually learns to sort of carry that extra perspective with them in their pockets, for when they're on their own, to have this sense of bouncing ideas off of a reliable thinker.
yeah, so it doesn't even have to be as formal as this full restructuring exercise, but just, practice is exactly how kind of Jacob described. But we're not done there, because sometimes thoughts can be buggers. They're really hard to shift sometimes. So we have other options. We can choose how we want to respond to it behaviorally. So I think Joey may share the link to this behavioral experiment YouTube link in the chat. We unfortunately won't have time to view it today, but I highly encourage you to look at that on your own time. I think it's only about 5 minutes, but it's an absolutely excellent example of how you might create or build a behavioral experiment with the person you're working with. And it's exactly that. You're developing kind of an experiment that will hopefully bring new information to the table. If we were to do something different to disrupt this cycle, would it work? What would that look like? Do we need more information? How would we gather that information? How might we interpret those results? So a lot of this is just this trial and error process, but everyone's this active participant. You also see there the behavioral activation, which is exactly that. It relies on your behavior to activate the desired emotion. Most of us kind of wait till we feel like doing something before we do it, but behavioral activation says, no, actually by doing it, you might actually get what you're hoping for. So that speaks to that. And then once you start developing different coping strategies that are proving effective or helpful, then you can put those on note cards as this resource for the client to access. Next slide, please. So another way to formulate is this values-based formulation, and it aims to do the same thing. It tries to look at, well, what are your current attempts to resolve the distress, and how helpful is it? Is it getting you closer to your values or your desired outcome, or is it maybe possibly keeping you in the same place or actually exacerbating the concern? But it puts it in context of your values. And this may be slightly overwhelming or confusing, so actually, next slide, please. So I've taken to really simplifying it, which is pictured here, and I know you can't see it well, but really you just have a circle in the middle to represent the client. You have an arrow pointing. In this case, I used the client's language, and she said despair. And the other end of the spectrum, you put whatever that value is, the desired value they're wanting to get closer to, and in this case, it was happiness for her. And after further dialogue and conversation, she recognized that she was engaging in a lot of cognitive behaviors like rumination. And assessing how that rumination was working for her, she decided it's keeping me in a place of despair. So, true to kind of acceptance and commitment therapy principles, instead of trying to interrupt the rumination, because in this case we had tried a lot of things and we just weren't getting the traction we needed, we decided, what if we don't try to do anything about the rumination, but instead refocus our attention on valued actions, value congruent living, what's going to support a more fulfilling life. So my husband is fond of saying, shine a light on it and it will grow. In this case, we're shifting our light or our attention to happiness, happy living, and happy lifestyle, and putting energy there. And the logic being that if we can create more space for life satisfaction and fulfilling activities, then we'll leave less space for despair. And she came up with different ideas. You can see starred on the right-hand side, or what are some of those valued actions. In this case, it was exercise, talking to people, creating new experiences, those kinds of things. Anything you wanted to add, Jacob, as far as like this shift in conceptualizing?
No, sometimes a simple diagram is really illuminating. And yeah, we often find out I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, just sometimes simple is illuminating.
Yes, simple. Next slide, please. So this obviously inevitably leads us to those happiness strategies, which are very well researched. Drawing from the IRT manual, these would be considered resiliency exercises in that manual. But these are, again, well-researched strategies that can be done very easily. And your goal is to how to support the integration of that into their daily life.
And I found helpful with finding bits of happiness to savor. Just like with setting goals, sometimes you don't have to shoot for the moon. You don't have to expect metaphysical fulfillment from a sunrise. Just expect maybe some colors and some shapes, and you'll be pleasantly treated.
Lovely. Next slide, please. And we clearly don't have time for this, but I really love this model, so I wanted it represented in the presentation today. Please don't pay too much attention to the direction of the arrows. They can go in multiple directions, but really it's a way of looking at our three emotion systems and how they might operate in our lives. CFT also talks about the role of our tricky brain, and it's another way of maybe conceptualizing how distress might be maintained, or happiness for that matter, can be maintained, but really looking at how these areas are being maintained. And it really communicates quite well that none of these parts of ourselves should be demonized. They all serve very vital, incredibly important functions in our lives. We don't want to get rid of any of them. We just want to bring them into more balance. So through that, it lends itself quite well to this development of a more compassionate self and compassionate other, and can lessen some of the weight of the shame that some may bring to the therapeutic process that can serve to immobilize. And again, I think Joey's going to share the CFT link, which is another 5-minute video that's excellent. I encourage you to view that.
Check out the compassion-focused therapy. It does a great job of addressing both how tricky it is being pilots of our brains, and just the process of finding who we want the captain to be, and hopefully that it's someone compassionate, sussing out the issues between our other selves.
Excellent. Next slide, please.
So eventually we want to have something called a wellness plan that we developed during the working phase. And that's basically, what are things that I can rely on for maintenance? What are things I need to watch out for as warning signs? And what are things I can do when I see said warning signs? So for me, things I value and need in my life are music, people, animals, food. Some things I can do daily to support my wellness, well-being include go for a walk, play some music, hang out with said people and animals. Some events or situations that have been triggers for me in the past include substance use, lack of sleep, isolating myself, hyper-focusing on things, early warning signs. Early warning signs that I experienced were seeing signs or advanced significant levels of significance to things that I experienced. Unhelpful thoughts or beliefs I've had in the past, definitely all or nothing thinking for me, or perfectionism, and people that can help. My mother, my friends, and I live with my mother. I can call my friends on the phone. And this wellness plan is also going to be a part of the closing phase, because it's sort of the outline for what the client will want to look out for going forward.
Next slide, please. And then, of course, we always want to be including cultural strengths, not only part of the wellness plan, but throughout the work. And some of us may be uncertain on how to more explicitly bring this into the work or through conversation. So I have referenced the cultural formulation interview, which can be easily found in the back of your DSM or in the simple Google search. And there's some great questions. One of the most basic and simple ones being, what are the most important aspects of your background or identity? Or what aspects of your background or identity make a difference to the presenting concern or whatever, is being reported. And although I do mention a racial and ethnic identity, of course, hopefully it goes without saying that we need to be conscientious of intersectionality across all minoritized groups, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, ability, nationality, sexuality, you name it. There's also a reference here to reevaluating the role of EE. We've put a lot of attention on the role of criticism, hostility, and what we might call emotional over-involvement. But there's a growing body of research that suggests that in more collectivist cultures or more collectivist communities, it's the absence of praise that can be more harmful than just the presence of criticism. Furthermore, what we might consider emotional over-involvement, if lacking, may be perceived as a lack of care in some cultures. So really being thoughtful about this role of expressed emotion and what we're supporting and how we look at that. But above all else, the client is the expert of their own experience. Period. The end. Otherwise, we run the risk of mirroring the same oppressive features of the larger system if we dismiss the narrative created from our client's perspective, our client being the expert of their own experience. That remains foundational. Next slide, please. And then lastly, you see this, as Jacob already mentioned, the wellness plan needs to be reviewed, updated, make sure it still feels relevant. Acknowledge the hard work that was done and the strengths that allowed you to get to this place. Elicit feedbacks about what some of those main takeaways are. And Jacob, if you wanted to speak to some of the things that come up for this piece.
As a client at the closing phase of therapy, I just want to know that I have places I can turn to in the future. Or if not a definite place to turn, I know how to go about searching for resources.
Excellent. Next slide, please. And if you forgot everything we just said, here it is. And I apologize I didn't properly cite it. This is a slide actually taken from Dr. Kate Hardy. She is referenced in our reference page. But this is at a glance the positive practices for working with psychosis experiences: relationship, curious questioning, drop assumptions, collaboratively work together, try things out, come up, skill development. Here it is. And unless you have anything more you wanted to add, Jacob, I think that concludes our time.
All good here?
Thank you so much. Let's maybe give a round of applause for our presenters. And also we have some time for questions, comments, thoughts. Really want to encourage folks, you can either unmute yourself and just ask, or you can type them in the chat and we will, kind of help folks to see your questions.
So my name is Kathy Scoville, and I just want to thank you so very, very much for sharing all this information and to be so brave as to get up and stand up and say that I need help, at some point in time in our lives, even though all of us do at some point, but to go before people is just really a brave thing to do. And I appreciate it so very much. Thank you for all you've shared.
Thank you.
Yes, that's.
Other questions, comments, thoughts?
question, actually, just thinking about your comment. I think you had said something on the lines of you were trying for more of a cognitive approach originally with the client, and then we're decided to shift gears to more values-based work. Can you speak more to how you sort of measure when something isn't working or when maybe pivoting would be helpful?
Yeah. Usually sometimes I'm using myself as the barometer and maybe that's not a wise choice, but if I'm sensing that there might be some frustration or discouragement, then I might just try to switch gears, see if I use different language, if that resonates or connects more. And usually you can tell the feedback is usually given like, pretty quickly, like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or that makes more sense than whatever. So the feedback feels pretty clear, but I think I typically am just saying how many times have we maybe revisited something similar and we're not feeling like we're getting enough traction. And then I might decide, well, what if we looked at it this way and see. But Jacob, what are your thoughts as far as, 'cause that's a good question.
I'm thinking as a recipient of care, I know I'm also always free to pipe up and say, I don't think this is route is being helpful. And it's nice if I know that I can do that rather than feeling too much pressure to play along all the time.
Yeah, if you're really fortunate, you'll get the direct feedback. This isn't working, and then it's like, okay, good. That I sense that too. Let's go back to the drawing board. Yeah, but I think to that point, maybe this is a good reminder even for us as clinicians to say, how is this working? to be more intentional in eliciting that feedback. Now that we talk this out loud. Really good question.
We have time for one more question if there is one.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura, and thank you so much, Raylan and Jacob, for presenting. I'm curious, as I work with folks, I think initial engagement into a specialty program can always be a challenge. Folks are in different places. This might be a bit of an open-ended question, but Jacob, what do you view as like what is most helpful in like initially connecting with a treatment program or with a provider?
I think one thing that I appreciated going into therapy is most therapists are good about having a sort of unconditional positive regard, and if not be like a yes man for everything, they'll affirm that there's a certain rightness to the way you are as an individual, and knowing that I'm never wrong for having a certain feeling or a certain thought really goes a long way towards making the space between the client and the therapist productive. But there is also an element of sort of like a fortune teller has to read someone's demeanor really quick and assess socially how effusive should I be. There's that raw social element too. I don't know, Raylan?
No, I mean, you said it perfectly, right? I mean, my thing is just really leaning on use of self. And just, I'm genuinely interested in people's stories, so it doesn't feel, that part doesn't feel hard. So really kind of, I mentioned maintaining a curious stance as part of this working phase, but really this is the engagement phase too. I'm genuinely curious about your life and what you're willing to share, an interest that you have, especially if it's something I'm unfamiliar with, wanting to know more about it. But that's always like the $1 million question of like how to support engagement in an authentic way that feels, good for both.
I just want to thank both of you so much for your just really thoughtful presentation. You covered a lot in a very short period of time, but really provided us a nice menu of what individual therapy within a coordinated specialty care team can be all about. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. The particulars are really important. And so I just really appreciate that. And Jacob, I love some of the metaphors that you used. I'm really going to be thinking about that. Therapy being like being able to see your situation in stereo. I love that. It really resonates with me. It makes a lot of sense. So just want to call folks' attention to that we've got some upcoming sessions. Our next session as part of this series will be on May 5th. And this is just a general overview of what is psychosis with Chantel Garrett, and our co-presenter is still being determined. The recording of this session will be available on our website, and Courtney put a link to that in the chat. She also put a link to a presentation survey that we hope folks will fill out to give us some feedback about the presentation as well.
Thank you all very much for inviting us.
Hope everyone has a great afternoon, and thank you very, very much.